The desert sun beat down with unrelenting force, turning the barren world into a furnace. Zira, the alien girl, stumbled through the endless stretch of sand, her body weak and desperate for water. Her blue skin, once vibrant and glowing, now looked pale and cracked under the harsh rays. She had been running for hours, maybe days, with nothing but the burning sun to accompany her. Every step felt like an eternity, and her throat was dry, painfully dry. She was running out of time. Zira was no ordinary alien. Her species thrived on water, and without it, her body slowly withered away. Her heart raced as she realized how close she was to the edge. She had been captured by a ruthless collector, one of the many who hunted down rare and endangered beings. He had kept her trapped for weeks, draining her of everything she had left. Now, as the sun set on the horizon, she had escaped, but the price of freedom was high. The thirst was unbearable, and her strength was fading fast. As her legs buckled, Zira collapsed onto the scorching sand. Her vision blurred. She could feel her life slipping away, each breath more difficult than the last. It was all over. The escape had been for nothing. She had failed. But then, a figure appeared on the horizon, a shadow against the dying light. Zira could barely focus, but she could see enough to know that it was a human. She had heard stories of humans brave, strong, and full of compassion, but she didn't know if this one would be the same. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get up and run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was too weak. The figure drew closer, and as Zira's head tilted back, she saw him, John. His face was grim, but there was something in his eyes that told Zira he was not like the collector. He was human, but there was a kindness in him that she couldn't ignore. John knelt beside her, his face shadowed by the fading light. Without a word, he pulled out a small, weathered canteen and uncorked it. Zira's heart skipped a beat. Water, she could smell it, taste it in her dreams, but she had no strength left to beg for it. She simply lay there, her mouth open, desperate for any drop that might fall. John didn't hesitate. He brought the canteen to her lips, and the first drop of water touched her parched mouth. Zira's body seemed to come alive at that moment. The cool liquid spread through her, soothing her cracked lips and easing the fire in her throat. She drank greedily, every drop a lifeline. The water was her salvation. The agony that had held her in its grip for so long began to fade, as her body slowly regained its strength. But John wasn't done. He kept the canteen at her lips, giving her more, allowing her to drink until she could no longer hold it. Slowly, Zira began to feel the effects of the water. Her vision cleared, and the unbearable thirst that had almost killed her seemed to ease. She could feel the strength returning to her limbs, and with each breath, she found herself more awake, more alive. John looked down at her, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Zira couldn't respond. She was still too weak. She simply nodded, her eyes meeting his. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt hope stir within her, a hope she hadn't known existed in this forsaken world. John pulled her up slightly, supporting her as she sat up. The sun was almost gone now, leaving only a dark, endless sky above them. The desert felt less threatening now, somehow. Zira's heart, which had once been filled with fear, now had a spark of something different, something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. But they weren't out of danger yet. The collector was still out there, and he wouldn't give up so easily. Zira's escape had only just begun, and now, with John's help, she had a fighting chance to survive. She wasn't alone anymore. The journey ahead would be tough, but for the first time, Zira knew she wasn't facing it on her own. As the darkness swallowed the desert, the two of them sat together in silence, the only sound the soft breeze that whispered through the dunes. The story of their survival had only just begun, and Zira knew one thing for sure: the last drop had saved her life. But now she had a new reason to keep going. The night was colder than Zira had ever expected. As the dark desert sky stretched endlessly above, she found herself wrapped in a strange but comforting silence. The sounds of the wind were like whispers, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. John was still beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance, though he said little. Zira hadn't realized how much the water had revived her. A few moments ago, She had been ready to succumb to the desert's harsh grip, and now, her body was stronger, her mind clearer. She took a deep breath, feeling her lungs fill with the cool night air. The weight in her chest had lifted, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the world was closing in around her. John finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice soft but firm. "We've got to keep moving. It's not safe here. The collector will be looking for you." Zira nodded slowly, her eyes catching the faint starlight. The mention of the collector sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent so long evading him, only to end up here, depending on a human she didn't know. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't cruel. She couldn't understand why he would risk his life to save hers. John seemed to sense her hesitation. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You're wondering why I'm helping. Why not just leave you to the desert? But I couldn't just watch someone die out here. You might be an alien, but you're still a living being, and that's enough for me." Zira's heart fluttered, an unfamiliar warmth flooding her chest. His words, simple as they were, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: kindness. She had spent most of her life running, hiding, fighting. Her people had been scattered across the universe, hunted for their rare abilities. But here, in the arms of a stranger, she found no fear, only trust. They stood together in silence, and though the desert stretched endlessly before them, for the first time, Zira didn't feel completely alone. John's words had sparked something deep within her: hope. They began walking, with the soft crunch of sand beneath their feet the only sound. Zira's senses were alert now. Every sound, every flicker of light in the distance, had her on edge. She knew the collector wouldn't give up easily. He had tracked her across galaxies, capturing her people, destroying lives, and turning her world upside down. She couldn't let that happen again, not to her, not to anyone. But the desert felt different now. The stars above were no longer a distant, unreachable thing, but a reminder of the life that could still be had. She had almost given up on that life. She had almost let the desert swallow her whole. But now, with John beside her, she saw a flicker of possibility, a way out. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as much as they could. Zira was aware of every footstep, every crack in the earth beneath her. John seemed to be keeping a watchful eye on her, making sure she didn't collapse again. He was strong, but there was something more to him, a quiet resolve that told Zira that he wasn't in this for glory or to prove a point. He was here to help, and that made all the difference. The night stretched on, the journey ahead uncertain, but Zira no longer felt the weight of despair. The collector's shadow loomed in her mind, but now, instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of power growing inside her. Maybe the desert wasn't the end of her story. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new, a chance to fight, to survive, and to live. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. As they walked side by side, the vast desert ahead of them, Zira couldn't help but wonder what lay in store. Would they escape the collector's grip? Would she ever find her people again? There were no answers to those questions, but one thing was certain. For the first time in her life, she was ready to face whatever came next, with John by her side. The winds picked up as the desert night deepened, carrying with it the faint scent of something unsettling. Zira and John had been walking for hours, the darkness stretching endlessly before them. She could feel the weight of each step, her strength still fragile from the earlier exhaustion. Yet, the further they moved, the more her confidence grew. There was something different about this human, a quiet determination that made her believe. For the first time, that escape was possible. John's pace remained steady, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly, searching for any sign of danger. Zira couldn't help but admire his resilience. Even though she was an alien, something in his actions made her feel a strange sense of belonging. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't a conqueror or a hunter. He was a protector, and in this unforgiving wasteland, that made all the difference. "Are we getting closer?" Zira asked, her voice raspy from the thirst that still lingered. Despite the water she had drunk earlier, John glanced over at her and gave a small nod. "There's a hidden settlement not far from here. We'll be safe there for a while." His tone was confident, but Zira could sense the underlying urgency in his words. They weren't out of danger yet. The collector was still out there, hunting for her, and John knew that the further they traveled, The closer they came to a confrontation, suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps reached their ears. Zira tensed, instinctively reaching for the small weapon John had given her earlier. A simple blade that felt almost laughable against the vastness of the desert. She wasn't sure what she could do with it, but it felt better than nothing. John held up his hand, signaling for her to stop. He crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness ahead. Zira followed his lead, staying close, her pulse quickening as she listened for any further sounds. The desert was silent now, almost too quiet. The footsteps grew louder. It was too late to hide. They were coming closer, moving with purpose. John's grip on his weapon tightened, and he slowly began to move forward, positioning himself between Zira and the approaching figures. Zira's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that this was it. This was the moment where everything would change. They had come so far, but they had never been this close to being caught. Without warning, the first figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing figure clad in dark armor. Zira's breath caught in her throat. It was one of the collector's men, unmistakable in his gear. Behind him, another shadow appeared, then another. They were surrounded. John didn't hesitate. With a quick motion, he moved toward the first figure, his blade flashing in the dim light. The man lunged, but John was faster. There was a sickening thud as the blow landed, and the man crumpled to the ground, silent. Zira's instincts kicked in. She darted forward, her blade aimed for the next attacker. The fight was chaotic, fast, and brutal. Zira's hands shook, but her heart burned with an unfamiliar fire. She wasn't going to let them take her again. Not after everything she had been through. For every step the collector's men took toward them, Zira and John took one more forward, pushing back with everything they had. The sound of clashing metal and grunts filled the air as they fought side by side. Two beings from different worlds united by survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the attackers began to retreat, realizing they were outmatched. Zira stood there, panting, her heart still racing. She glanced at John, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. "We've got to keep moving," John said, his voice low, his expression hard. "This isn't over." Zira nodded, a sense of resolve settling deep within her. They were closer to freedom, but the journey was far from finished. She wasn't sure what awaited them, but with John by her side, she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer fighting alone. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of rolling sand dunes under a sky that was slowly lightening with the first hints of dawn. The battle with the collector's men had been intense, but they had managed to escape, at least for now. John and Zira moved with urgency, their steps more cautious as the light grew brighter, revealing the harsh landscape in stark detail. Zira was still recovering, her body weak but alive, and every step she took felt like a battle against her own exhaustion. They hadn't spoken much after the fight, both lost in their own thoughts. Zira could feel the weight of the desert closing in around them again. She had nearly given up several times, actually, but John had pulled her through. She had to admit, she was beginning to trust him, though part of her still couldn't understand why he was so determined to help her. It was a mystery that gnawed at her as they pressed forward, the landscape around them growing more treacherous. "You okay?" John's voice broke the silence, his tone surprisingly gentle. Considering the harshness of their surroundings, Zira didn't answer immediately. She just nodded, feeling her breath come in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure how long she could keep going. Her body was telling her to stop, to rest, but the fear of being caught again by the collector kept her moving. John glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "We'll stop soon. There's a cave up ahead. Should be a safe place to hide for a while." Zira gave a small nod, grateful that John seemed to have a plan. Her mind had been too foggy to think straight after the fight. The adrenaline had kept her going, but now it was starting to wear off. She needed to rest, to heal, to regain what little strength she had left. The journey ahead seemed impossible, but somehow, with John, it didn't seem as hopeless. The cave wasn't far, and as they neared it, Zira felt a small surge of relief. It wasn't much, just a hollowed-out space in the side of a rocky hill, barely enough to hide in. But in this unforgiving world, it was the closest thing to safety they could hope for. John entered the cave first, checking it for any signs of danger. Zira followed cautiously, her senses on high alert. She was learning to trust John's instincts, but after everything she'd been through, trust didn't come easily. The cave smelled of dust and earth, and there was a strange, almost welcoming stillness inside. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zira sat down on the cool stone floor and closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment to breathe. John settled beside her, pulling out some supplies from his bag. He didn't say anything as he handed her a small ration of food. Zira took it gratefully, the food oddly comforting in a world that had been nothing but brutal. She ate in silence, her thoughts racing. The escape, the fight, the humans, everything was so overwhelming. She had never imagined a life like this, never dreamed she'd find herself in this situation. As she finished the small meal, Zira turned to John. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." John met her gaze, his eyes hard but sincere. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said simply. "You're not just some alien. You're a living being, and I couldn't leave you to die in the desert. I'm not about to let the collector take you." Zira felt a lump form in her throat. She had been running from one hunter after another, always afraid, always on the move. But John had shown her something she hadn't known. She was missing: humanity. It was a word she had heard, but never really understood until now. He wasn't just saving her because it was the right thing to do. He was saving her because he saw her as something worth saving. "I don't know how I can repay you," she said, her voice barely audible, but filled with sincerity. John shrugged. "You don't have to repay me. Just survive. That's all I want." And in that moment, Zira knew that the road ahead, though fraught with danger, wouldn't be as lonely as it had once felt. She had someone by her side. Not a savior, not a hero, but someone who believed in her when no one else had. And that, for the first time, gave her the strength to believe in herself. They sat in the quiet of the cave, the world outside feeling a little less threatening. But deep down, Zira knew the battle wasn't over yet. The collector would come again, and this time, they would have to be ready. But for now, they had this small moment of peace. And for the first time since her capture, Zira allowed herself to hope. The cave, once a refuge, now felt like a prison to Zira. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as she and John waited for the storm to pass, both literal and metaphorical. The sandstorm had hit with little warning, and they were forced to stay in the cave longer than they had planned. The howling winds outside only served to remind them of how fragile their situation truly was. Zira sat against the cold stone, her thoughts drifting. She had never known peace like this. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she wasn't running from someone, something. Yet, she was still haunted by the constant fear that the collector would find them. The feeling gnawed at her insides, threatening to crush the fragile hope that had begun to blossom within her since meeting John. John, on the other hand, was restless. Zira could tell he was thinking, formulating a plan. He had been scanning the surroundings every now and then, peering out through the small crack in the cave's entrance, ever watchful. The silence between them felt heavy, and Zira couldn't help but feel that something was coming, something they weren't prepared for. "You've been quiet," Zira spoke, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to speak, but something about the silence made her uneasy. "What are you thinking?" John looked up from his position near the entrance, his gaze meeting hers. There was a weight in his eyes that told her he was already anticipating the worst. "I'm thinking we can't stay here for much longer," he said. "The storm will pass soon, but the collector won't, and when he finds us..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Zira knew what he meant. The thought of being caught by the collector again sent a shiver down her spine. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John was quiet for a moment, his hand gripping the hilt of his weapon as he thought. If the collector has his way, he won't stop until you're back in his hands. His eyes hardened, but there was something else in them now: resolve. "But we're not going down that easy." Zira's heart pounded in her chest. She had never known someone like John, someone who would risk everything to protect a stranger. He wasn't a hero, but in that moment, he felt like one to her. For the first time, she wasn't just another prey for someone to hunt. With John beside her, she was more than just an alien. She was someone worth saving. The storm began to die down, its roar slowly fading into the distance. The wind softened, leaving behind an eerie stillness. John stood up, wiping the dust from his hands. He didn't speak, but his body language was clear. He was ready. Zira could feel the shift in the air. They were about to leave the safety of the cave and step back into the unforgiving world. "Let's go," John said, his voice low and determined. He extended a hand to her, and for the first time since meeting him, Zira hesitated before taking it. There was a flicker of doubt in her heart. Could they make it out of here alive? Would they survive what was coming? But when she looked into John's eyes, the doubt faded. He believed in her, and that belief was enough for her to keep going. As they stepped out of the cave, the storm had passed, and the vast desert lay before them again. But this time, it didn't feel quite as menacing. Together, they moved forward to beings from different worlds, bound by survival, ready to face whatever came next. The journey was far from over, but Zira no longer felt alone. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had someone who truly understood what it meant to fight for survival. And with that, they walked into the unknown, side by side, ready for whatever challenges awaited them in the harsh desert. The desert stretched before them, its vastness both a blessing and a curse. As the sun rose higher, the air grew hotter, and the oppressive weight of the sand beneath their feet seemed to drag Zira down with every step. John led the way, his movements sure and deliberate, but even he couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. They had been on the run for days now, always moving, always watching. The collector's pursuit felt endless, and the desert itself was a relentless enemy. Zira's strength had returned, but not completely. The wounds from her previous ordeal, physical and emotional, still lingered, hidden beneath the surface. But with each passing day, she felt the bond between herself and John growing stronger. They had become a team, working together as one, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses. John's determination was unwavering, and Zira had come to rely on him in ways she never thought possible. But now, as they moved further into the heart of the desert, something felt different. The air felt heavier, charged with the presence of something looming. Zira could feel it, a sense of danger closing in. "John," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, his hand instantly going to the weapon at his side, his body tense as he turned to face her. His eyes searched the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. "I feel it too," he muttered under his breath, his voice low but steady. "We're not alone." The feeling grew stronger with every passing second. The hairs on the back of Zira's neck stood on end, and she instinctively reached for the blade at her side. The desert had always been unforgiving, but now it felt like it was alive with danger, as if the very sand itself was conspiring against them. A distant sound reached their ears, barely audible over the hot wind. The rhythmic thumping of footsteps, too many to be just one person. Zira's heart raced. It was the collector's men. They had found them. "Run," John said, his voice urgent but calm. He grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. They dashed forward, their feet kicking up the sand as they sprinted toward a rocky outcrop in the distance. The pounding of feet grew louder, closer. Zira's breath came in short, sharp gasps, but she pushed herself harder, her survival instincts kicking in. She wasn't going to let them catch her. Not now, not after everything. As they reached the outcrop, John stopped abruptly, pulling Zira into the shelter of the rocks. They crouched low, the sound of pursuit drawing nearer. Zira could feel her pulse thudding in her ears as they held their breath, waiting. Her eyes flicked to John, who was already scanning the landscape, his expression unreadable. "I'll take the front," John whispered. "You stay here. I'll make sure they don't see you." Zira didn't argue. She knew what needed to be done. John was a warrior. This was his world, the harsh one that she had only just begun to understand. But she couldn't stay behind, not anymore. She had fought too long, too hard. She had to stand with him. Before John could stop her, Zira moved quickly to his side, her hand on his arm. "We fight together," she said, her voice steady, filled with the same determination that had brought her this far. John looked at her, and for a moment there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. But then he nodded, the corners of his mouth curling into a rare, small smile. Together, then, the sound of footsteps grew louder, now just around the corner. Zira's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt more alive than she ever had. She wasn't alone anymore. She was no longer a helpless alien running for survival. She was a fighter, and with John at her side, they would face whatever came next. The first of the Collector's men appeared, and the battle began. The desert, now bathed in the harsh light of midday, seemed to mock Zira's every step. The battle had been intense, but they had made it out for now. The Collector's men had fallen back, nursing their wounds, but the danger was far from over. Zira and John had barely escaped. The scent of dust and sweat thickened the air as they continued to trek through the unforgiving wasteland. Every footstep was a reminder of how far they had come and how much farther they still had to go. Zira glanced at John, his face set in a hard line, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was always on alert, always watching for threats. She had learned to rely on his instincts, his quiet strength. But even he couldn't ignore the weariness that had begun to creep into his movements. The journey had taken its toll on both of them, and the endless desert felt more like a cage with each passing hour. "We can't keep running forever," Zira said, her voice hoarse from both the heat and the tension. "Eventually, they'll catch up. The Collector won't stop." John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped walking and looked out over the sand, as if searching for an answer in the empty expanse. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice quiet but determined. "I know, but we don't have to keep running." "Not forever," Zira frowned, confused. She had always thought that survival meant moving, hiding, never staying in one place for too long. But John's words suggested something different. A shift in their approach, a change in strategy. She turned to him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" she asked. John finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering resolve. "We stand and fight." Zira's breath caught in her throat. She had expected many things from this journey, but not this. Standing and fighting against the Collector seemed like an impossible task, one they weren't ready for. Yet, looking at John, she could see the fire in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about survival. He was talking about taking control, taking a stand. "John, we're outnumbered. We've barely escaped every time they've come after us," Zira said, her voice strained. "How can we fight them? How can we win?" John's expression softened for a moment, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Because we have something they don't. We have each other. And we have the will to fight for something more than just survival." Zira felt a stir of emotion at his words. She had never truly fought for something greater than herself. She had always been running, hiding, trying to survive. But now, standing with John, she felt something shift deep within her. Maybe, just maybe, she could fight for something more, for her freedom, for her future. The air felt different now, charged with an energy that wasn't there before. Zira had always been alone in this fight, but now she had a partner, a true ally. They weren't just beings from different worlds anymore. They were a force united by a common goal. The desert seemed less intimidating now, the endless stretch of sand not as oppressive. Zira felt a new strength inside her, one that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just a rare alien anymore. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. John gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We'll take them down together. It's time to make our stand." And for the first time since she had been captured, Zira felt a sense of hope that wasn't fleeting. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the Collector would never stop hunting her. But she was no longer afraid. With John by her side, they would face whatever came next. They walked on, no longer running from their fate, but heading straight into it together. The battle was far from over, but now they were ready.